Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. My interview last week with Jared Dillian, author of the Daily Dirt Nap, is now out on YouTube. So if you haven't seen that video, go and check it out now. Again, I want to preface that I am a subscriber to Jared's Daily Dirt Nap newsletter. I highly recommend it. I believe it's about $500 or $600 for the year. There's a link to subscribe in the description below. Let's see if we can get him a couple subscriptions for obviously taking his time out of his busy schedule to come and do the interview. Again, I think it's an entertaining read. It's a informative read, and I highly recommend that. Next, my interview with Steve Keen will be coming out next week. That was a very interesting conversation, which kind of leads me into this week's video, because having conversations with these two individuals who I think are very brilliant in their own spaces kind of brings me back to one of my favorite quotes, which is, if you don't get the macro right, the micro doesn't matter. And I have to kind of keep that in mind as I'm hearing all of these forecasts coming out for the Canadian housing market. Being sort of an insider in the space, as I get access to a lot of the sort of, thought leaders or respected individuals here. And so, listening to a lot of their presentations and being sent some of their reports, I find it interesting because, these individuals, they're known for one thing, and they're obviously respected, and I respect them for that, but they don't focus, they're not incorporating the macro. So I'll give you an example is, this one individual, and again, I'm not going to name any names or companies, but they're talking about the PreSale market here, and they're looking at their dashboards and they're saying, well, it doesn't look that bad. It was pretty slow. We're looking at it's going to be pretty tough, but we see things getting better, and basically, we're actually very optimistic on the outlook because our statistics are showing us that as of right now, the sales drop off's not that bad. Pre-sale pricing not necessarily being reduced much at this point. Some incentives here and there. But never once any discussion about, okay, well, what does the economy look like? What does the macro look like? What does the interest rate movement look like? And, rates falling from, 2.6 pre-crisis to 2.4, is that really stimulative? So there's no real conversation about that. It's more so my framework, my numbers in my dashboard look good, so thus must be good moving forward. But I think that if what I like to incorporate is overlaying the macro on top and then looking more specifically at the sector. And, for example, we can talk about my conversation with Steve Keen. And basically Steve's premise, if you've read any of his work, is that in order for house prices to grow, you need mortgage acceleration. So you need mortgage credit growth to basically accelerate, which can then support housing prices. So when you get housing at these levels and you get mortgage rates where they're at, it becomes, you have to basically ramp up credit growth. And I think it's, Steve, as he alluded to, it's going to be very difficult to do that in this environment. Now, again, it's not impossible, but it's going to be very difficult to have consumers have the desire to take on a lot of debt. Because I think right now, when you get into these kind of economic shocks where everyone goes, oh my gosh, what's just happening? Everybody looks around at their own balance sheets. So whether you're in the private sector, whether you're an individual or you're a business, everybody looks and says, okay, I need to start cutting costs. I need to build in a cash reserve. So they're doing the right thing. But the right thing for the individual or for the business is not the right thing for the economy, because 65% of GDP is consumer spending, consumption. And so when consumption gets crippled, and when people go into save mode, that is a drag on the economy. And economist Richard Koo, who is one of the sort of brilliant minds behind balance sheet recessions. He did a lot of work in the 2008 recession for the White House, and he was actually recently on an interview at Real Vision TV, And he talks about this one, again, being sort of like a balance sheet recession. The natural reaction for businesses and for households is to clamp down and start saving. You have a 20, unofficially, but realistically, you look at the numbers, when you account for all the variances, you have about a 20% unemployment rate. That probably will push up to 25%. So you have 1 in 4 people unemployed today. Now, again, a lot of those people will get their jobs back, but how long and when? Could take someone 6 months to find a new job. Could take even longer potentially. And so the natural inclination is to save money and repair that balance sheet, and that is the right thing to do. And so in that environment, it's hard to spur credit growth in the private sector because nobody wants to borrow money. It doesn't matter if the interest rate is zero, donut. Nobody wants to borrow money. It's like the federal government giving out all these interest-free loans to businesses and saying, hey, listen, guys, you can borrow this money interest-free up until, I think, what is it, a 3-year loan, 4-year loan, something like that. And as long as, if you repay it all within the 3 years, you get to keep $10,000 or whatever it is. It's not really help. As you can see, I mean, businesses are still failing, and there's just because, again, these businesses, it's a cash flow problem. It's not necessarily access to credit. They don't want to take on more debt. And so this is the problem when you kind of get into these balance sheet recessions, is that you can lower interest rates. A mortgage rate can go from 2.5 down to even say 2%. I mean, is that really enough of a encouragement for people to borrow money? I think over the long run, yes, but in the short run, no. The psychological impact is tightening up. So I think that's kind of overlaying the macro thesis, which brings me to my next point, which I think that I think central banks, again, if you kind of follow their normal path, the reaction function, I think that we're going to go towards these negative interest rates. And there's part of me believes that, we heard Jay Powell, Federal Reserve, come out this week and say, oh, we're not going to do interest rates. We don't believe in them. We don't like them. The problem is, now get me, this is where we talk about the macro. The problem is that right now, the US dollar is too strong. And so what happens is you have all these emerging economies of the whole world, basically, because it's the global reserve currency, borrows in US dollars. And so as you get into a deep recession, investors and dollars and capital flows to the safe haven, which is, the world reserve currency, the US dollar. And so as that US dollar begins to strengthen, it weakens the emerging market currencies, and it makes it that much more difficult to then repay and service their US dollar denominated debts. And so what's happening, as you can see, is the Fed is printing money like crazy, massive amounts of quantitative easing. Basically, they're trying to devalue the US dollar, but it's not working. And so now you have all these other central banks, everybody's basically trying to devalue their currency, trying to help out their own economies, and so they're all taking rates down to zero, some of them taking into negative interest rates. And so how is the US going to devalue the US dollar? I just think that they're going to be, whether they want to or not, I think that I'm starting to believe that they're going to be forced to negative interest rates. They're going to be forced to negative interest rates because they have to devalue the US dollar in order to alleviate all these problems. And so again, I kind of overlay that, that kind of guides part of my thinking towards all of this. So it's great to look at the housing numbers, and again, I get a lot of people asking me every single day, Twitter DMs, emails, Instagram DMs, everything, phone calls, is what's happening in the housing market? When should I buy? What's going to happen? Seems like prices aren't coming down. Seems like prices are kind of coming down. And I have to tell everyone, you just need to relax. Housing is not the stock market. It's been 6 weeks. It's been 6 weeks since this lockdown basically commenced. Real estate doesn't not really move in a 6-week fashion, particularly when volumes drop to the lowest levels we've ever seen. So you're better off, if you want to get a clear understanding of where prices are going to be, as opposed to drawing conclusions today and saying, because prices are only down 2% today, or they're not even down at all, or whatever you want to say, that you can extrapolate that moving forward. Again, I basically say I don't know where pricing is going to be. I'll be the first to admit that. There's so many unknown questions. Again, I believe that the probabilities to the downside are obviously elevated, but it's better to basically just check back in 6 months, because to get it, just housing doesn't not move that quick. Again, I think that when volumes collapse as they do and the demand picture looks weak, that I am in the belief that you're not going to see a reflation in the short to medium term. That's my view, and I'm happy to have that wrong. But what I find interesting out of all this is, again, just all these bank economists putting out the report and trying to and forecasting. I read one from a big bank, and it was saying they had put out a forecast that by Q4 2021, national home prices would be up 11%. And to try to model where house prices might be in 18 months is the dumbest shit I've ever seen. It's literally like, I know these guys need to get paid and make money and try to look productive, but it is so incredibly pointless. How do you model a global pandemic? How do you model a financial system with negative interest rates? Is this virus over? Are we going to get a second wave? Are we going to get a vaccine? If we're going to get a vaccine, are we going to get it next year, 2 years, 3 years? Do economies open and close? There's just so many unknowns that to sit here to try to model house prices is completely ridiculous. But what I find interesting is that, I'm obviously a little bit on the more pessimistic side in terms of the sort of near to medium term. But, it's interesting because, a lot of the realtors that I work with, the colleagues and stuff, is very optimistic and naturally optimistic bunch. But I think a lot of them believe that we're just going to kind of return to normal. This is just this is a disappointing virus that, has temporarily caused us to hit the pause button, and in 2 or 3 months people are going to start getting their jobs back, feeling confident, going out there, and sales are going to basically begin to normalize. And again, I don't share that view, just because I think it's a misunderstanding of the economy and how it functions and how long it may take for businesses to rehire individuals. But I have to laugh because it's almost like I almost think that the Bank of Canada and CMHC are putting out arguably the most bearish reports of any bank out there, or any sort of forecast in the real estate space. CMHC, for example, was saying that their best case scenario, they believe, again, I think it's stupid to model this, but they believe that the best case scenario is by the end of 2022, home prices will be back to their pre-virus levels by the end of 2022. So that's a pretty long recovery. But again, they said that's their best case scenario. Now again, that is what they're saying in public is probably not necessarily what they're thinking behind closed doors. So keep that in mind. And then you had the Bank of Canada out this past week with their financial stability report, suggesting that the mortgage arrears rate will double the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. So they're expecting mortgage arrears, mortgage foreclosures to essentially double what they were in 08-09. And that is, again, on an assumption that that these mortgage deferrals, which is 15% of Canadian banks' mortgage books, will in effect sort of stabilize, and people that are being deferred are going to basically catch up. So in my estimation, those models might actually be potentially too optimistic. Now again, we have to look at other scenarios where you have like Equitable Group, for example, the alternative lender, 18% of their mortgage book is in deferral, 18%, and they're willing to defer people for up to 6 months. So that's a nice long leeway. Now the question again that we have to ask ourselves is, what does the economy look like in 6 months? Does it just rebound? Does this virus kind of go away and dissipate? Or in 6 months, which takes us into, what is that, June, July, August, September, October, that takes us into November. That's kind of your peak flu season. Is that when you potentially get a second wave? So there's so many questions that we don't know. And again, I'm going to be happily the first to admit that I have no idea what the outlook is, but I prefer to assess things in probabilities. And so I'm continuing to be focused more so on the longer picture in terms of where I believe the market could be in 4 to 6 months, and trying to position my clients for that scenario and taking that again with a grain of salt. But that again is my view. We'll continue to monitor this. We'll continue to have guests on this show that can provide different perspectives and balanced perspectives. Again, if you watched Jared Dillion's interview, I think he was quite balanced. I think he was quite bullish on asset prices in general. Obviously felt that there was a pullback, likely pullbacks in certain other areas, but he's quite optimistic on central bank policy measures. So and then you had Steve Keen, who again was feeling if there wasn't further fiscal policy measures that this could get ugly. So really good mix of individuals, and I think that's most important right now is just educating yourself and looking at the different viewpoints right now and trying to position yourself accordingly. Basically, just kind of hedging those downside risks is kind of how I'm looking at it today. So. That video brought any sort of value or entertainment to you this week, hit thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.